Hey guys, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon here with my longtime mentor, Dr. Donald Lehman. And if you like these videos, please take a moment to like it and share it. It really helps drive the message and the science that we're putting forth. What's up, Don?
Oh, good to see you.
Yeah.
Nice and hot in Chicago.
Yeah, San Diego is not very hot. It's beautiful here. We were at the beach earlier. And I'm really glad that we are making time to talk about this very specific topic. You and I were talking earlier about just really the confusion behind the different movements. So there's the keto movement and the calorie control movement and what actually drives obesity. And
Yeah.
it's really confusing for people, especially when there's different paradigms of thinking about it. And I suppose the question is, do they make sense? So for example, you and I were talking earlier about the insulin model of obesity, which is if insulin is high, regardless of calories, you put on weight. And I would love to hear your perspective on that.
My perspective is definitely one of calories. Calories do matter, but it's important to realize that all calories aren't equal, metabolically different. And so, I think one has to start with people will get along on different diets. Some people will like a keto type diet that's very low in carbs, and some people may like a vegetarian or vegan type diet that's very high in carbs and low in fat. And the evidence is both can be successful, so you kind of have to mix and match. The confusing gets into, insulin resistance and diabetes are a very clear illness,
Right.
and it causes a lot of toxic effects. And so we know that the body has trouble handling a lot of excess carbs. You and I talk about, if you do a lot of exercise, you can burn a lot of carbs. But if you eat a lot of carbs and you're above calorie intake, then the body has some really difficult problems managing that metabolism.
Right. And we were talking about earlier, one of the things to mention is that the body actually only has one way to deal with that excess glucose load. Just one.
Yeah.
And that is insulin. It's to produce more insulin.
If you're exposed to too many carbs, you have to have insulin eliminated for you. I mean, we have a lot of mechanisms to maintain blood glucose on the low end.
Right.
I mean, we can make glucose through gluconeogenesis. We store glycogen. We can make it from amino acids or glycerol.
You can liberate it from some of the stress hormones, help
There's
liberate
a lot of ways to make it, but there's really only one way to get rid of it, and that's with insulin.
Right, which would make me think that perhaps we weren't meant to consume the quantities of glucose that we are. That being said,
in the forms that we tend to get it, I mean, we get a lot of very refined carbohydrates, refined wheat and corn and oats and things, and we get it in breads and rice and pastas and chips and things, very starchy types of things, and frankly, it's beyond our calorie needs. So we're now in a storage mode. We tend to gain fat, and people have different views. You and I think about the metabolic dysregulation as a muscle issue,
right? Which is interesting that's not the paradigm or the lens at which everybody is thinking about it. It's kind of that old school belief that it's really about adiposity. While adipose is an inflammatory organ, it does produce adipokines, and there's issues with visceral fat. Is it the origin of the problem? I don't think so.
Fat is relatively a passive energy storage under normal conditions. It's not really controlling metabolism. Clearly, if you become too obese, if you have too much body fat, it becomes highly inflammatory.
Right.
And so all the pathology that people think about is absolutely true. But you get into that issue, do you really want to study the pathology of being obese, or do you want to look at the cause of why you got there?
And that is really sharp. I mean, that's sharp. It's interesting because even if we were to look at the pathology doesn't begin in the fat tissue. That's a secondary storage organ. It's
I mean,
primarily
you
the
know, people
defects are
people
in the
debate,
muscle.
yeah, people debate those kinds of things, and I mean, the reality is that debate's been going on for 40 years, and that line of study hasn't gotten anywhere at
Right.
all. I mean, we know that if muscle is healthy, higher protein diets, carbohydrates and calories under control, we know you can correct body composition. And we know that it's a healthier aging approach in terms of sarcopenia,
Right.
functional mobility, and all of that. So, I think the study of adipose is interesting, but for me, it's a study of the pathology of being fat, which, if you're committed to being obese for the rest of your life, I guess you should study it. But
Right.
I think we should figure out how to be lean.
And it's not necessarily the initial step. It's not about having issues with adiposity or growing fat tissue or fat tissue hypertrophy or hyperplasia. That's secondary to impaired muscle. If you have
Yeah,
highly functional muscle and you have more of it and you're training and you're depleting skeletal muscle and then repleting it, you're
it's
not
interesting.
going to go along and subsequently put on more fat. That's secondary.
Yeah, it's interesting how the fat theory seemed to recycle. I mean, the whole
Yeah.
issue of hyperplasia and hypertrophy, uh, I studied along with Gene Allen and Terry Etherton back in the late
Hmm.
70s in graduate school. I mean, we looked at the process of fat cells developing in size versus number and the effects on insulin. I mean, that's just recycling things that we knew
Right.
50 years ago.
So let me ask you a question. And I, I do partially feel torn about this, and this is perhaps not super scientific of me. Do you believe that insulin drives adiposity, or do you think that it's actually when calories are controlled that driving obesity is really a total calorie problem, not an insulin problem?
Yeah, I think it's a calorie problem. I think that when we're eating more calories than the body burns, we start to disrupt metabolism. Part of that disruption then is an insulin problem.
Hmm.
Insulin then has to be one of the ways we get rid of it. So now we're overstressing that hormone system. So it becomes part of the problem, but it's not the origins of the problem. It becomes it becomes one of the fail-safe approaches the body uses to try to correct the problem,
Right.
which is the basic calorie macronutrient imbalance.
So why do you think the concept of eat less and exercise more has failed so miserably?
Um, I think on the exercise standpoint, what most of the research has shown is that when you exercise more, your appetite tends to kick in and you just sort of
Hmm.
compensate for the calories.
So you think that
Um,
there is an overcompensation, but then what, when you control for calories and then you increase protein. So let's say you've got two groups. You have one where they've got calorie control and perhaps higher carbohydrate. And then the other one is, $1,500 or $1,500. Yeah, it's a calorie bank account.
yeah.
1,500 calories of, higher carbohydrate, 20% protein, and some fat. And then you have a 30 to 40% protein diet with the same amount of calories, 1,500 calories. Arguably you would see better body composition changes and probably a higher fat reduction in the higher protein group, which,
Yeah. I mean,
really just accounts for
that
muscle.
concept, that concept that eat less and exercise more doesn't work, um, that's not totally true. I mean, there have been multiple studies, including ones from my lab, that have shown that if you eat less the way you just described, higher protein, lower carbohydrate, and exercise more, the body composition effects are far greater. We have shown that you can make the weight loss essentially 95% body fat if you
Right.
combine exercise with the calorie reduction. So, and we all know that if you lose more fat and less lean, your likelihood to not regain the fat is much better. So
Right.
the idea that it doesn't work, um, I think is a fallacy of how people have done experiments and how the lay public actually applies it.
You know, it's interesting in clinical practice, I have seen, you know, it's not often, but I of course always correct for protein intake. And that always moves the needle, almost always.
Yeah.
But I do have some individuals who eat incredibly low calorie, and I find them very weight loss resistant.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, whether it's a thyroid issue or whether it's a gut microbiome issue that perhaps we don't have the
Yeah.
tools to test for, I don't know. But there are certainly some people that have a quote higher metabolism than others. And there are interesting aspects to that, you know, I don't really know how to make sense of it.
Yeah, I agree. Everyone's metabolism is not the same. The efficiency is not the same. There have been multiple like twin studies by Claude
Right,
Bouchard and things
right.
like that, where they took identical twins and overfed them by 1,000 calories, and everybody's eating the same thing, and one pair of twins gains 7 pounds and the other gained 26. I mean, so we know metabolism's not all the same. Um, from doing hundreds of people in our obesity clinic, one of the things that I find is that what people think and say they're doing isn't always true. And one of the things that I think is most common is people will have a diet that is really great 5 days a week, and
Hmm,
then they'll go out and splurge on a Saturday.
right.
And in their mind, what they remember is all of the effort they put in Monday through Friday, and they ignore the fact that they had 7,000 calories on Saturday and a blue.
Yeah. That's a really good point that, you know, that kind of takes us off into this, should you have a cheat meal?
Yeah,
Um, and it's interesting. There is something about compliance that every fourth day, and actually I got this when I worked with Lane, that every fourth day he would, you know, and this is back in the day, he would give me one day that was higher carbohydrates, just higher calorie, and it
yeah,
did improve compliance. So
yeah,
perhaps rather than doing that, you know,
sure.
one day a week where you're having 7,000 calories, if you have a very strategic way
Yeah.
you know, of perhaps having a more liberal approach, but having it be very strategic is a
Yeah,
benefit. You know, I
I
do like
think
what you're saying.
I think it has to be planned and strategic. I think you have to make it a consistent approach that you're going to use. Things like intermittent fasting and reduced time feedings. I think all of those strategies, if they do in fact control your calories, are viable.
Right,
But just because you said you did it doesn't mean that you actually got a good
right,
outcome.
right. Also true. Well, I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to have this discussion on, is it really the insulin model that drives obesity, or is it some, you know, perhaps really just that calorie driven model?
Mhm.
So you guys, if you like this video, like it, share it, comment. We really appreciate you watching.